My name is Elliott. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and associated with the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm joined today with Gary Sullivan, who's also a professor in the Department of Animal Science. And today we're offering kind of a unique webinar, really kind of focusing on consumers who are interested in purchasing directly from local producers. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about how to purchase, things to consider, different labeling schemes, and specifically we'll talk a little bit about food safety, given kind of what's going on with E. coli. And so I'll go ahead and get started. What we encourage you to do, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of Zoom, or put them in the chat box, and we'll be happy to address them either as we are doing the presentation, but we'll have some time at the end of the presentation. So let me go ahead and share, and then we'll get going. Okay, everything look good, Gary? Presentation mode? Okay, great. Well, there's just been a lot of, at the university, we work a lot with producers and kind of interface with consumers. And the big thing that we always get about is, there's this larger trend that's kind of in the market of just to buy local food products. There's a lot of reasons why people want to purchase local food, kind of shown down there. Sometimes we want to just build our community. Sometimes we think it will foster some food security, or a lot of times it's because we want to kind of know and have that personal relationship with where our food's coming from. Farmers markets is generally the place where that has kind of originated, but from the meat side standpoint, there's a lot of ways where you can purchase it without actually going into a farmer's market. And really, this has been growing for the last 20 to 25 years. You probably heard a lot about it in the news. And really, COVID-19 was what we consider a massive shift in this kind of demand for local food products. And that was because we couldn't actually go into the retail stores and food service to actually get a lot of the products that we're used to buying. And so there's been a huge demand from there. And so we just wanted to kind of talk a little bit specifically about sometimes called freezer beef or locker beef. And sometimes maybe you've looked at it and it's like, I want to buy half a beef or a quarter beef. So first, let's just talk a little bit about these labels. And there's difference. We're going to separate them really in between two labels. We're going to talk about in terms of kind of labeling for the food product and labeling in production. So if we were to look at these eggs, what would we know about where these eggs came from? We have some different labelings, like 100% all natural. Then we have some different labelings of how it was produced, that no hormones, no antibiotics. It has large amounts of omega-3s. That's compared to omega-6s. So they're talking about some nutrition standpoints. What we don't actually know is that this claim of no added hormones in eggs is, chickens aren't raised with hormones actually. And so that's an example of a label that's on there. It's true, but it's not really a differentiating factor. So there's lots of ways that labels can be helpful and also less helpful. And so when we think about a lot of these labels, we've all probably seen some of these labels out there. What is a natural product, or if it's grass-fed or organic, pasture raised, free range, humane. And I just put a little bit of some of these labels that you might see. This is not exhaustive. If you want to look at all the labelings, we'll provide these slides to each one who's attended today, and you can click on a lot of these links and see all those labels. But let's look at what a common label called natural. And generally, when we think about what's natural, it's basically saying that it's not been raised with the antibiotics or hormones. And hormones are growth hormones, and it's used for a variety of reasons. Antibiotics, just like us as humans get sick, animals get sick, and a lot of people will administer antibiotics because to help the animal kind of recover. And so a steer or like a beef that is raised without antibiotics or hormones is generally called all natural. And then we talk about, grass fed. What is grass fed? This is probably the one that's been getting the most kind of attention over the last, 5 to 10 years. And the reason is because there's this difference between what we call grass fed and grass finished. All for the majority of cattle or beef that you'll buy, they were all raised on grass at some point. So when the animal was born, it's generally will be raised on grass until it's about 6 or 7 months old. And then most beef that's commercially produced will go into what's called a feed yard where they're fed a high protein diet, generally consisting of corn. And so when we say it was grass fed, there's a difference between whether it's grass fed or grass finished. Grass finished can generally mean that it was on grass the whole time. And there's some kind of unique things there. So really understanding that grass fed, it will all be grass fed at one point. It's where it's grass fed throughout its entire lifetime. So the other one that's been really popular, this is a USDA organic certification. Organic certifications really started coming out in the early 2000s. And really it's to get this certified organic seal, it needs to have organic feed. So any grain that can be fed, it can still be fed grain as long as it's organic grain. It has certain housing, health, and handling protocols that need to be kind of maintained. And then in addition, it can't be given any antibiotics or hormones. So even if it's raised all of its life and then gets sick right at the end, we want to do the humane thing and treat it with antibiotics, then it won't be allowed to be sold organic. And this is a relatively small share of meat products that are out there that are USDA organic, just because it tends to be a little bit more difficult to produce an animal like that. So the question is, could this be considered organic? And the answer to that is yes. So I would say sometimes we have an idea of what organic looks like and what the protocol for organic is. So those or cattle there could be being fed organic feed. They have packing on the bottom where they can lay down, so they're not laying down on hard ground. So it's meeting those types of specifications, and we don't know if they've been given implants or antibiotics, but those could be. And so just knowing that kind of when I'm buying a certain label, it may be different than what I have in my mind. And so that's why there's been this large push to kind of be local production, meet the producer, talk to the producer themselves. The other way that we've seen a large growth in this is in the egg operation and in the broiler operation, or if you're buying chicken breasts or chicken wings. And it's really this difference between pastured and free ranged. And when we talk about pasturing, it's really just that they have access to the outdoors. And generally, there's some requirement to say they have so many cubic feet per animal. It's generally, about 1 cubic feet per animal. And so as long as they have access to the outdoors and they meet these certain space requirements, they can technically be considered free range. And so just like we have, just because they have access to outdoors doesn't necessarily mean it's a positive thing. Look at this animal over here. It has access to outdoors, it's free range, but we'd say that it probably isn't in great condition. So just recognizing that even though it's pasture free range, that we have to also consider the animal welfare considerations as well. And so this on the left-hand side is a typical large-scale egg laying operation. Sometimes you might have heard this in the news called battery cages. So hens are in individual cages and they lay eggs. The eggs fall down and they kind of go on a conveyor belt out. If you buy eggs that are just generally traditional white or brown eggs, most of these come from these types of operations. Then we have what's called a cage-free, but it's a large-scale laying operation. So this is still considered cage-free, right? Because there's no cages, they can freely walk around. Generally, they meet certain spacing requirements. They have access to food and water. They can go and roost where they want, and that so you can see where they have little kind of roosting barns where they can go and lay their eggs, and then those eggs are collected. And so this is a typical cage-free large scale. So if you're buying from major retailers and they're buying cage-free eggs, it's likely coming from an operation like this. And so this is a large scale free range egg laying operation. So free range in the sense of they can go in and out, access to the outdoors, and they can go in and lay their eggs. And so if you're buying, you know, or free range eggs, this is a typical operation that it would come from. Now, this is when you're buying directly in the retail market. Now, if you're buying from a local producer and you can talk to them about their operation, generally they're either be pastured or free range that you're going to be buying at a local market. But you just if you're before you purchase those eggs, just make sure and ask about that operation to make sure you're getting the type of operation that you think you are. And this is giving an example. This is a kind of a big in the regenerative agriculture. This is generally what we think of when we talk about regenerative agriculture. We're talking about moving animals. They're at one place for one time, and then we move them to a different location. This would be a typical operation like that, where it's kind of a small scale pasture raised, and you can still see there's a little place where all the chickens can go and lay their eggs. Now, on the flip side, that's all the way that the animals are produced. Now, once that animal is produced, then the animal is processed and broken down into different meat products, and then the meat can receive certain labels. So if you've heard of halal meat or kosher meat or natural meat, generally what this means is that at harvest, something occurs to basically make it in compliance with that. So in kosher, for example, these are meats that come from animals that have been slaughtered and processed according to the Jewish law, and also certified by a Jewish authority, typically a rabbi. Same thing with halal. There's different either prayers or Islamic law that needs to be followed in order to make it halal certified. And so that has nothing to do with the way the animal was raised, but in the way that it was processed at harvest. And so knowing that there are differences in the labels, some of the labels that you're going to purchase are going to be relative to the way the animal was raised, and the other ones are going to be relative to the way that the animal was harvested at the processing facility. Another thing that you might hear as you're working with producers or talking to them is this whole idea about dry aging. And essentially what dry aging does is that the animals will go and they'll hang there for a certain amount of time, generally 10 to 14 days. And essentially what happens is some of the liquidation or evaporation kind of takes place. And Gary, maybe you can talk a little bit about that from kind of the meat science standpoint.
Yeah, so post-mortem, especially in the beef carcass and the beef side, you want to have a little bit of time for that carcass to age because you will get uh, some degradation of proteins through natural enzymes, and that will cause an improvement in tenderness of the beef. And so oftentimes we want to have some aging going on. Larger facilities will do what they call wet aging, where that carcass will be fabricated early post-mortem, usually typically 24 to 48 hours afterwards. And then the individual cuts will be vacuum packaged or cryovac. You'll hear it referred to that way. And that allows that aging to continue. Where in smaller facilities, they typically hang them on the rail. While it technically is a bit of a dry aging process, it's not quite the same as the extent as you see on the picture on the right-hand side. And, some people think that there's an advantage from a flavor standpoint where you get a bit more beefiness and some maybe more complex flavor with dry aging versus wet aging, but really it's up to the consumer on what they like best. Most processors will allow up to about a 14-day hanging time. If you want to go longer, they may allow it based on their schedule, but there's usually premium that has to be paid by that because their coolers are often a limiting factor or limiting constraint when it comes to smaller processors.
Yeah. And so when we talk about, generally when we go and purchase beef, we're talking about purchasing a certain quality grade. So every product that you will purchase in the retail store receives a quality grade from USDA. And those products, the quality grade is specific to how much intermuscular fat or whiteness is in the middle of the meat product. And so when we talk about USDA Select, it generally means that there's not a lot of fat inside the muscle. Choice is most product that's out there. It has a little bit of this kind of fat interdispersed in the meat product, and then Prime is heavily dispersed in there. And so this product is all out there. So as we go from Select to Choice to Prime, the dollars per pound for the same cut will increase. Now, if you're buying directly from the producer and you buy, let's say, half a beef or a quarter beef, it is not going to receive a quality grade. And so there could be some differences in the quality that you're buying from the producer. So sometimes it's good to ask, do you get your animals inspected? What type of, quality grade do you expect them to get? So you can get a better idea of what you're actually paying for as a consumer. Are you paying for, a prime steak, at a good price, or are you paying overpriced for a whole bunch of select quality? And so you'll see these different kind of shields on any meat product that you'll buy, and all it has to do with, the quality or how much fat is actually interdispersed inside the meat products. And so,
One of the
yeah, go ahead, Gary.
advantages of knowing the intramuscular fat is it's really related to the quality of eating experience. The more marbling that's in there, the more likelihood of a positive eating experience comes out of it. One of the things that's really kind of amazing of what's happened over the last probably decade is the increase of quality grades that has happened, and especially being in Nebraska, we get a lot of high quality, highly marbled beef. Across the US, the prime category went from about 3% in 2011, like Dr. Dennis has on here, but now we're actually closer to about 12% on that. And so we have fewer selects, we have more choice, and we have more prime. And so being in the upper Midwest, there's really a great opportunity to get high quality beef through this process. Now, if the animal isn't inspected, they can't go through the grading process. But one of the things that's come about is there is the introduction of a remote grading process that smaller processors that are inspected can opt into using in the future. And so that's a neat opportunity that comes along with it.
Great. And thank you to the person that asked that question. We'll go ahead and answer that now before we move on. Their question is certified Piedmontese better than grass-fed? Is it healthier and or worth the cost? So I'll just kind of give my perspective on that. I don't know. So certified Piedmontese is a big company here in Lincoln, Nebraska. I don't know how the production process that they use, but certified Piedmontese would be like similar to buying certified Angus. Piedmontese is a breed of animal, and they've done a good job at marketing it. Just like if you go into Hy-Vee, you can buy certified Angus beef or CAB. And so Angus is a breed of animal, like a type of animal, and Piedmontese is a type of animal. And so when we talk about whether it's better than grass-fed, you could have a certified Piedmontese steak that is grass-fed and one that is corn-fed or finished on protein or corn. And so I don't know how they, whether they're using grass-fed or corn-fed. And then when we talk about it in terms of health, worth the cost, sometimes different animals have different flavoring. So I guess I'd leave it up to you to decide whether it's worth the cost. But Gary, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the Piedmontese breed tends to be a little bit leaner than others, but due to some genetics of the breed, they tend to still maintain their tenderness even without as much marbling. And so, one of the things that I think it does, as well as certified Angus beef and all the other branding, is it gives consumers choice, and ultimately, it's up to you to decide if it's worth it or not. It's a kind of a consumer choice and an individual choice, and so. Uh, I think they're a good company and they make a good product. But it's really up to you if it's better or if you want to do it or if it's worth the cost.
Yeah. Difference there, breed quality, Piedmontese Angus is just a type of animal. The difference is grain fed versus grass fed. That will produce a little bit difference as well. Okay, Gary, why don't you tell us a little bit about, so we have this beef animal or this hog, and big question that I get when I talk to consumers is how much meat am I actually going to get out of it?
Yeah, so I think this is something that most people aren't really or don't really know what they're getting and what it really amounts to as they're going through it. And so one of the things to think about is when you're buying this, you're either buying it as a whole animal, you're buying it as a half animal, or in beef, they will go to a quarter of an animal. And so you can buy it in proportions and you really need to kind of need to figure out how much space you need and how much meat you're actually getting in the process. And so these are a couple nice slides just to give some examples of what happens when you're going through it. And so when we are processing these, you're oftentimes going to be purchasing the animal based on the meat of the weight. One of the things to keep in mind is if these are going to a custom processor, and we'll cover it a little bit more later, you have to be identified as the owner in advance of the purchase, or multiple owners if you're going to be purchasing a portion of the animal. And so when you think of it, this example talks about a 1,200-pound beef animal. And then if you're going to go to that, you're going to put it then into a carcass weight. And so that's really what happens after the harvest process, and then what's going to be hung in the cooler. And we'll lose about somewhere around 35 to 40% of the weight through that process. That's removing the internal organs, it's removing the hide, the head, the blood, some of those things like that. And then from that carcass, there's still parts that aren't edible. And so as we go through and fabricate that carcass down to the retail cuts that we have, we'll end up with another about 60% to 70%, depending upon how that carcass is cut. And so when we think of it, we're going to get a different amount of meat based on how we ask for it to be done. If you want things that are entirely boneless, and ground product, you're going to get a little bit less than if you're going to do things that have like a roast with the bone included, or you keep the uh, the ribs, the short ribs with the bone in, and so that'll impact the amount of meat that you get. But regardless of how you have it cut, ultimately these animals are typically going to be purchased on the meat or the weight of the carcass as it goes through it. But when we look at it from a beef animal, we're going to end up with somewhere about 500 to 550 pounds of meat that comes out of that carcass. One thing to note is this example, and it's a great example of going through it. It was put together several years ago, and the average carcass weight of or live weight of an animal has gone up. And so we're probably thinking of about another 300 pounds of live weight that may be on many of these animals. And so it may be a little bit more than this. To put it in perspective, if you're going to be getting a whole beef and needing to go pick up the meat from your local locker, oftentimes you're going to have to be having somewhere between 6 to 7 kind of standard size igloo coolers to be able to haul that meat. And so I think that's just a good idea or a good perspective of how much you're actually going to get as you go through that. And then also then as you go and think about the freezer space that you have at home, you'll need a deep freeze, either chest or upright, to really be able to store all that meat as you go through it. When we look at a pig, we're going to have a little bit less weight than what we do on a steer. And that's why we still may have half of a weight or half of a pig, or you may have a whole pig on that. But when we think of it, a pig will actually dress a little bit higher than a market beef will. And so we probably end up with somewhere about 25 to 30% loss during that harvest process compared to what we have in a steer or a heifer carcass and a beef carcass. And then as we go and cut that into chops and roasts and others, we're going to end up with about 65% of that, or or excuse me, somewhere between 65 to 75% of that weight, depending upon how we go about doing it. And so you may end up with 120 to 130 pounds. Again, pigs are a little bit heavier than when this example was put together, so it may be 150 pounds you're getting back. But to put that in perspective, you might be at 2 or 3 coolers worth of meat that's going to be coming home from a pig.
And I'd say kind of the question is if you're working with a producer, kind of understanding how heavy are animals when on before they're harvested, and then generally when they're sometimes they're called carcass or hanging weight. Say generally what is that hanging weight, and then you can get a good idea of how much beef you're actually or pork you're gonna get back.
And it'll also impact the purchase price because if you have an
Yes.
extra 300 pounds of live weight, that can add a lot of price onto it on a beef, or if you, or, you know, you have 200 pounds of carcass weight maybe on that, or on a pig, another 30 to 40 pounds, it can make a difference on what that animal costs. And when you're going through your accounting, it's really going to be critical on that total cost of production or of the purchase.
Yeah.
So when we go through and think about it, then this is just an example of what you might get if you're getting a half of a beef. And so when we think of it, we can get it cut and we can get T-bone steaks. And, you know, if we think of that loin portion that we're going to get the T-bones, and it's really T-bones and porterhouses together, we may end up with about 14 steaks there. Now, if we cut them thicker, we'll get less. The other thing is you may, instead of T-bones, get tenderloins and strip loins. And so you can request different types of cutting based on what you want. And we'll get to that a little bit later about what we refer to as the cut sheet. But then you'll also have sirloin steaks and sirloin roasts. You'll end up with some arm roast and stew meat, soup bones that go along with it. Similar number of rib steaks or rib eyes if we want to make it boneless. We end up with round steaks. A lot of people will now just make those into ground beef, or if you want to, some places offer tenderized or cube steaks or minute steaks. You know, anytime you do those, they may have an added charge if you're going to do further processing on any of those cuts. But round ones are really commonly done to that. We end up with chuck roast and rump roasts and short ribs, and then ground beef. One thing I think most people don't realize is how much ground beef comes from a carcass. And if we think of a typical animal processed, we're going to end up with about 40 to 50% of that weight is going to come back as ground beef. And if you want fewer roasts, those get put into ground beef and you're going to end up increasing that. And so thinking about what your family needs is really going to be important as you go through it and requesting it later on. When we think of a pig, we're going to end up with a half a hog. We're going to end up with pork chops, you know, somewhere between about 12 to 14 pounds. You can get these cut, again, bone in, or you may get boneless, depending on how you do it. If you get boneless, you can also get back ribs. So if you like to be smoking the product, maybe you want to go with a boneless pork loin or boneless pork chop, and then you have the back ribs. But again, it's talking to your processor to know what they provide. You'll end up with spare ribs, some shoulder roasts or butts. Sometimes they're cut in half, sometimes they're whole. It really depends on what you request. You can have hocks that can be smoked or fresh. You'll end up with some sausage. You'll end up with ham and bacon. The other thing that we have mentioned on here is you do have the ability to save variety meats depending upon where you're at. And so you may request to have the heart, the liver, the tongue, the oxtail saved back in beef and pork, the same ones except oxtail isn't available, but you may save back fat or lard. And so depending upon what the processor offers, you may do that. The other thing that'll happen sometimes from pigs is if you are a hunter, sometimes you like to save back that pork fat to be able to be used later on in venison sausage and mix it in. And so sometimes there's a request for that. Now, anytime you do have these special requests, there may be extra costs that are added on as you get that. So in this next slide, it's important to think about, we have 3 different weights that we refer to. And so we think of the live weight of the animal, and that's the one that's most natural for people to think of. And cattle are going to be somewhere between probably 14 to 1,500 pounds on average. Pigs somewhere between around 300 pounds on average. Lambs will probably be somewhere between 120 to 150 pounds on average as you're thinking of it. And so that's important as we go through that. And then we look at the hot carcass weight, and that's really going to be, as I mentioned before, that weight that's left after we've removed the hide, we've removed the organs, the head, the blood, as it goes through that process. Now, depending upon the species, it's going to impact how much we get back in that. Pigs will be greater than cattle from a or a dressing percentage, or what's the percentage of live weight that's remaining on the carcass. Uh, we're going to be about 70% on a pig. We're going to be somewhere around the low 60s for a beef, and we're going to be somewhere in the mid 50s for a lamb. And so we do have differences that are associated with that. Here, if we think of a hot carcass weight, we're going to end up with about 60% of the live weight. We're going to end up with about, after we take that to retail cuts, we'll end up in this example, another 65% of that hot carcass weight being in our retail cuts. And so in this case, it's talking about 430 pounds of meat coming from it. But remember, if you're paying for an animal on a carcass weight, if in this example at $4.15 per pound, when that translates into final product that you're taking home, you may be at $6.38 for that in freezer, in package, at home price. So it's important to think about what that all in price is when you're doing it. We have had some people in the past ask for everything made into ground beef, thinking that it was the whole weight of the animal, not realizing that difference in that yield of retail cuts that comes from the hot carcass weight. And so it's a confusion that can be made that really can increase that price to a point where people aren't expecting it.
Yeah. So when we talk about that, I liked how you said that, Gary, that, a lot of times when I see this on Facebook or when I'm talking to producers, they'll say, this is the price for hanging weight. Or that's when they say hanging weight, what they're meaning is hot carcass weight. And so depending upon what you're getting, you can translate that back to, that $6.38 a pound. And so oftentimes when you think about that animal, $6.38 a pound times that $430, that's pretty sizable. And the reason why is when we think about how much meat we actually consume, we're buying all that meat at once versus buying, little amounts of meat throughout the entire year. And so this is some work that the USDA has done, basically looking at how much meat do consumers eat on average throughout an entire year. And so sometimes when I've talked to producers, like, well, how do I know how much meat I consume? I don't track that. Well, this is a good way to kind of approximate, how many adults do you have? And you can think of, depending upon the age of your child, a child being they're going to eat half as much as an adult. But on average, this past year, an average adult ate across all products 105 pounds of chicken and 50 pounds of beef and 50 pounds of pork and 55 pounds of beef and 14 should be turkey, 14 pounds of turkey. And so that's how much one adult ate generally throughout that entire year. So turkey, you're like, well, I didn't eat turkey besides Thanksgiving. Well, think about maybe you had that sandwich and it was a, roasted turkey sandwich. Well, that's where we kind of getting those types of turkey products there. And so we think about that's how much meat that an average adult is going to eat, one adult. So if you think I've got 2 adults and 2 kids, then you can kind of multiply out and say, oh yeah, this is how much beef I'm generally going to eat throughout the year, or how much pork. And then you can say, yeah, is it worth it? Am I going to eat through all that product within a year or 6 months or 9 months? And then the other question is, how much meat are we actually, or how much are we going to spend on that product? And so once again, we look at, what is the average cost per pound per adult or per pound of meat? And then we think about how many pounds that consumer is going to eat, or us as consumers are going to eat. And really we're, per adult, we're spending close to, about $750 on meat a year. So when we think about like, wow, I spent that much on meat, we don't necessarily know that because maybe this week we bought 2 pounds of steak and then 3 weeks to buy 4 pounds of steak. And throughout the year, we eat, 55 pounds of meat per adult. And so, when we think about this is kind of our bill or our meat bill that we're spending. So, when you're thinking about should I go and purchase this from a producer, and that bill tends to be pretty large because you're purchasing all that meat at once instead of just sporadically throughout each week. And then when we think about how much of this is coming generally from my income, we think about this in terms of disposable income. So after we've paid taxes and whatnot, and uh, beef tends to consume about 2% of our disposable income. Pork and chicken tend to consume about 1%. So in conjunction, we're probably spending 4 to 5% of our income, our disposable income, on meat products or beef product or meat products in general. So where can you actually get prices? So maybe you've seen these on Facebook. They're saying, hey, buy half a beef, or hey, hogs are ready for Christmas. And then they don't list the price. And they say, if you're interested, let me know. And so you say, hey, I'm interested. And they send you a direct message on Facebook and they're saying, this is, and you're saying, how much is this? And they say, oh, it's this price. Well, the question is, was that a good price, right? Or is it too expensive? And so when I talk to a lot of consumers, they're saying, what are some ways that I can kind of check whether this price is in line? And I'll just kind of give 3 ways that's a good quick check or BS check on some of this stuff. And the first is just go to your grocery store. Think about the products that you buy, and you can go in there and say, well, how much are they, charging for ground beef? Generally it's $4.99 for 80/20 or 80/15, depending upon where you're buying it, maybe $5.99. You could go to a farmer's market and just kind of walk around and look at different meat products there. You could also, USDA also provides kind of retail prices for these kind of variety products as well, which I'll show you. So this, once again, we'll be sending out the slides, excuse me, and the recording of this to each one of you. And you can click on these links. So if you click on this link on this this page, it will take you to essentially the retail page. You can click the beef, and this is what it will show you. And so on the right-hand side, it will show you, we look at the right-hand side, it shows you all the different cuts of meat and the average price range for the different qualities. So if we look at choice for bone-in ribeye steak on this week, the price range from about $9 to $14, and this is for the Midwest, so of which Nebraska is a part of. So think about, the different products that you're buying and say, am I buying this on the high end or on the low end? Another nice thing to do is to look at this other retail report. And the reason why I kind of bring up this one is because if you're buying from a producer and saying, well, this is grass-fed beef, this isn't conventional beef that you'd buy in the retail store. It's like, okay, there might be a premium associated with that. And so this report here will actually show you if you're buying brisket, so beef brisket, and it's a flat beef brisket, and it's grass-fed, what is the average price? And in this case, it was about $12 a pound. So this kind of gives you a nice idea of just like a reliable kind of, way to kind of double check whether that price that a producer's quoting you is in line with what you'd expect. And so when you think about some of these farmers beef prices, in a lot of cases, producers, I'd say, are actually not charging as much as they actually should. And I say on average. And so if you look at just kind of, we went to some farmers markets and looked at kind of what these prices were at, and then you look at just like a pretty popular retail store, it's like, in some cases they were charging less for certain products, and in other cases they were charging kind of right in line. So in some cases it can actually be a pretty good purchase to buy locally from the producer. So this is an example. I'm not going to go through it all, but just know that when you buy a product, generally the producer will say something to the effect of, it is $3.20 a pound, and you are also in charge for processing costs. And so uh, this example kind of shows you that there is a processing fee. Now, the producer is basically taking money for the animal. You have to pay the processing plant, and it's generally on a dollars per pound of meat processed. So the bill that you pay uh, is not just the one that you pay to the producer. It's generally you also have to pay the processor once the animal's been harvested. And so know that there's going to be these kind of combination of these. You have to pay for the animal and the processing. And so figure out where they're processing it, how much it's going to cost per pound, so you get a good idea that that cost per animal or that dollars per pound of meat is the combination of those two, right? It's the cost to process the animal and to purchase the animal. Put those total costs together gives you your kind of idea of how much it's gonna cost. So this kind of gives an example that you can kind of walk through. So Gary, why don't you talk us through a little bit about you've been mentioning about these smaller processing plants versus larger. Walk us through a little bit about what it means to be federally inspected versus I'm buying freezer beef or locker beef from a local producer.
Yeah, so in the US, any meat that's sold needs to be inspected by the USDA. And then there are a few exceptions to that, and that's really where some of the exemptions and the small lockers fit into. And so if you ever want to buy individual cuts of meat, that has to be something where it's done at a USDA inspected facility. And so that means that the animal is going to be looked at before and after harvest by an inspector. It's going to be done in a sanitary manner. And the USDA's job really in this process is to make sure that we have a safe, wholesome, and properly labeled food supply. And so when Elliott was talking about all of the different labeling categories, those are all have stringent criteria that USDA puts on it. And anytime you make a claim on that, you have to be able to justify and support what that claim is. The other things like where he had some of the natural programs like Certified Angus Pro or Certified Angus Natural or the Natural Lamb, those are also established programs that have to be ensured that they are met by the processor and in those cases also by the producer that that animal can be labeled that way. And so if you go out to the local farmers market and you're buying meat, it is going to be product that's inspected under a USDA inspection, or depending upon the state you're from, it may be done at a state inspection. And so Nebraska does not have a state meat inspection service, but many of the surrounding states do. In those cases, whether it's state inspected or federally inspected, they do have to follow the same food safety criteria. And so any of those products are going to be equally as safe as you go through it. Now, the other option then is one of the exemptions that comes along with that. And that is what we refer to as a custom exempt process with that. And so when you're buying that bulk meat, you're really buying an animal and then paying for the service for that to be processed. And so if you want to jump ahead to the next slide, Elliot, we can kind of look at that. And so that one difference that goes with that is you are the owner of that animal when it comes in. And when that happens, the producer has to say when that animal is delivered, who owns the animal. And so it may be Elliot and I bought a steer together and we each want to have half of that. We're buying the actual animal and then having it processed. The producer is not having it processed and then selling it to us. And so that's really that clear distinction is the custom exemption is where you're paying for a service to have your own animals processed. And with that, because it's your own animal, it has to be labeled as not for sale, and it's only able to be used for your household use, for your employees, or your invited non-paying guests. And so if you look at the regulations, that's really what it refers to. This is not product that can be sold later on. And sometimes, especially during COVID, we saw this type of product on Facebook Marketplace and things like that. And I do know that USDA really went after some of those people that were selling it that way because of that lack of inspection that goes with it. Now, does that mean the product's not safe? Absolutely not. The processors really want to make sure that they do a great job in producing that that animal and that meat. And one of the things that goes along with that is you can think of it this way is if they produced meat that was unsafe and they got someone sick, just from there's likely to be liability standpoints, but also just from a standpoint of knowing you got your neighbors and local people sick. It's getting people close to you sick that you don't want to have happen. And so as a meat processor myself, I tell my students, and when we do it and we talk to the employees that we hire in the meat lab on campus, that safety is the number one thing that we have to do. If the product's not safe, nothing else matters. And so and I'd say that holds true whether it's inspected or whether it's custom exempt that goes through it. So those are the two options that really go along with it. And when we get into that process, and when we're talking about freezer beef, this is really the process that goes into it, is you want to find a livestock producer. And if you don't know a producer yourself, you may reach out to a local locker plant that you have, and they may have some relationships with producers that regularly bring livestock into their plant. And so you can reach out to a a livestock producer directly, or if you don't know one, you may reach out to that local meat processor. And then you decide what you want. You purchase that animal or agree to purchase that animal that goes through it, and then that animal goes to get harvested. One of the things that is necessary as you're going through this is you have to decide what you want for your products that come out, because there's many different ways to break down a carcass and gives you different cuts that you end up with. It may end up with different both cuts as well as amount of ground product that goes along with that. So you tell the processor how you want it cut. They will have what's called a cut sheet that you do that through. And then in the end, you will pick up the meat. Now, one of the things that's just as important as we talked about how long a carcass could hang on a cooler from a beef standpoint, processors' other limitation oftentimes is freezer space. And so if you're getting an animal processed, they will tell you what date it needs to be picked up. And that's because they need to make sure that they have enough space for future animals that are going to be processed in their freezer. If you don't get it picked up on time, they may charge extra for you if you have it. And so as you go through it and think of it, then there's really important things to talk about. Sometimes you pay the producer at the time of pickup. Sometimes there's a deposit that comes with it. Sometimes it's based on the hanging weight. And so depending upon how that's done, they may do it differently. And so the other part with it is, as Elliott said, is you have two different costs with it. You have the cost of the animal, which is going to be where you pay for that animal to the producer. And then you have that cost of the processing to the processor that must be done as you go through it.
Yeah, so as Gary was saying, you can find a livestock producer yourself. Most of us may not know a livestock producer, so the question is, where do you find it? Gary mentioned you can reach out to a local processing plant, or they're sometimes called lockers. There's other ways that we would suggest also that you can find. You can go down to the farmers market and meet people there. There's actually a couple local meat directories that are basically maintained by different agencies. So I put those, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, they have farmers markets in many different states, or local meat producers in many different states. Here in Nebraska, the Nebraska Department of Agriculture has like a local food and meat directory of producers. At the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, we have the Buy Fresh, Buy Local network here, and we maintain a list of individuals. You can always contact us, Dr. Sullivan or myself. And of course, Facebook Marketplace is probably the place where most people are going to have kind of exposure to this. A producer will just post an image saying, hey, I've got this beef or this hog going to the locker on this day. Would you want to let me know if you want to purchase it? And so you can always meet producers that way. But as Gary was talking about, when you're buying this animal, we have to understand, we got to have, a couple we'd call five different considerations that we really need to consider. The first is freezer space. So kind of on that right-hand side, do we have enough freezer space to store, 450 pounds of meat? That's a lot of meat. And so we just got to make sure we have that much space. And the second is, are we going to eat through all that meat? And so that's where I was kind of talking to about how trying to get an idea of how much meat we actually eat. And if we don't, we can use some kind of general estimates. And the question is like, who's going to pick this up? So generally, the producer will deliver the animal to the processing plant for you, and then you will need to go and pick up the meat that's processed. And so if it's a long distance or that processing plant is, an hour or two away, who's going to drive there? So then you have some costs on time and transportation and making sure that meat stays cool while you're taking it back to your home. And then the second or the fourth is when we talk about just like the cuts, as Dr. Sullivan mentioned, you get lots of different cuts of meat. Some of these cuts you may not have initially cooked with. And so there's lots of options there. You can just say, convert it into a product that I know, generally ground beef, or it gives you an opportunity to kind of explore different ways to kind of cut that product. We would encourage you to think about different ways to uh, cook different products, and we'll provide some ways to do that. And then the last is just the cost. I would say that last one is generally the biggest thing that we get questions on. It's just like, wow, it's going to cost me how much to purchase this animal? And it's because we're having to purchase that cost or the purchase basically our year supply of beef at one time, and that's generally pretty pricey. So, Gary, you can tell us a little bit about small meat processors, and then talk us a little bit about once we purchase that meat, what do the cuts look like?
Yeah, so in this picture, you can really see two different styles of plants that go on it. The plant on the right is really going to be more of a large scale processor, where they're doing lots of animals, have a high economy of scale, and they're going to be doing really more of our commodities type production. Most of the product that you find in the retail market and food service are really processed in this type. Where if we look on the left, this is more of what we think about when we get into smaller meat processors. And really, they're serving a different clientele. When you think of it, it's not the same market that they're serving in the same standpoint. They're both producing meat, they're both doing it in a safe manner, but it's a different market. And so if we think of it where we're buying an animal and getting it processed, or even a half or a quarter of an animal, there's not a way you can do it at the large scale like you have on the right. Where on the left, where it's more of a, for lack of a better term, a batch process. You're bringing in an animal at a time, you're getting it processed through, and you're able to keep identity. You're ensured that you're getting the same product back that goes in from that animal. It really allows them to do it. Their job, and it's more expensive to get done than if you would have at a large meat plant, but the customization that they do is what a large plant can't do. And so that's really where that small meat processor is serving, is it provides those local markets. It's providing that direct marketing of product, as well as the food, what can be found in farmers market and those things. And so they play an important role in serving that local and regional community, as well as really economic development. One thing many people don't think about is these small locker plants have many jobs, and oftentimes they're good paying jobs that are important part for that economic and rural vitality that goes along with it. So when we look at the next slide, this is just an example of all the different cuts can come from beef, and not even all of them that goes through that. And so this is can be a bit overwhelming when you look at it, but I think that what's important is to think about, what do you actually use as you're going through it? Now, most people probably buy a few different types of cuts. They're going to buy ground beef. Me, I like a ribeye steak, so I'm going to be more apt to buy that than a strip steak. And we'll get some roast and things like that. But we don't necessarily always vary so much from what we have. But the advantage of buying it from a retail market is you can choose exactly what you want. But when you're buying an animal, you have to go with that entire amount of the animal. Now, one of the fun things is the creativity that can go along with using up all those cuts. It gets you maybe outside of your groove that goes along with it. But otherwise, you may not typically buy flank steaks, but you will get a flank steak if you get a half a beef. And so using that, making sure you go through and doing it. Now, this is a guide that's on beef. There's similar ones on pork and lamb as well as you're going through it. But it's really kind of think about what you use as you go through it. The next thing that's with it is your local locker is going to have a specified set of cuts that they can do. And they probably have what's referred to as the kind of their standard cut. So one of the things to do as you're doing this is talk to the processor, and many will take time to go through it with you because they want to make sure you get back what you want. Or maybe the livestock producer is very familiar with it and they may be able to give a little bit of guidance on it. But these are important to think about as you're going through it is what's on it. And so if you aren't sure what the cut is, that's where going to those sheets like the reference sheets, like what was on the previous one that goes with it, but you're going to get a combination of it. Now, like we mentioned before, there are times that you pick one or the other. And if you want to have T-bones, you're not going to have strip steaks and fillets. Or if you want strips and fillets, you don't get T-bones. And so you have to work back and forth of that. Think of what you're doing. The other thing that if you look on this beef sheet, it's going to say, do you want some of your roast? Do you want it as a roast or stewed meat or burger? And so you go through it on a process to think about how you want it done to make sure that as you have it, it's going to come out how you want it with it. And so now the other thing is you can pick how thick of a cut you have. You can pick how many go into a package. If you're having a family, maybe you want 2-pound ground beef chubs. If you're a couple, maybe you only want one. And so you think about how it's going through that. The more customization and the more time that it takes, there may be upcharges that go with it. And so this cut sheet that was shown on the last page talks about a $50 increase of a beef carcass if you want the steaks packed individually. That's because it takes extra labor and it takes extra packaging to get that done. And so any of those upcharges are really done because it takes extra time, extra labor to get it done, and there's a premium that goes with it. The other thing that will go with it is your processor will have different packaging methods, and these are important because they will impact that characteristic. If you look on the lower right-hand side, that's going to be a picture of the paper wrapped product, and this is what all products used to be when you got it. If you go to some to meat counters now, you will still see products that are packaged that way. And that way, or if the picture that looks kind of freezer burnt with the frost with it, that's what you got at retail at other places where it's pre-packaged for you. Neither of those are as good of a freezing method as if you can get it vacuum packaged. And so if you look at the upper right corner, that's going to be a vacuum packaged product, and that's going to give you an increased a longer product quality and shelf life. Now, in either of these, it's not a safety issue that deteriorates, but you're going to start losing flavor and you can start getting some warmed over aspects with it. If you're looking at a paper wrap product and that's how your local locker does, you probably want to have that product used within 9 months or so of it. If you're in vacuum package, you can probably go over a year, maybe a year and a half, and still really have a good eating quality experience that goes out with it. If you're looking at that overwrap freezer package, you probably want to use that within about 4 to 6 months. The other thing to keep in mind as you go with it is different freezers impact the product quality difference or product quality characteristics differently. Putting product in the top of a refrigerator freezer combination, that product is going to have less of a quality and shelf life because you get fluctuation in temperatures, as opposed if you keep that into a deep freeze, you're going to have a longer quality life that goes with it. And that's regardless of the packaging method that goes with it. And so that's important to think of as you're going through that.
Yeah, so we hope you've learned something today. We covered a lot. We've covered, things about labeling. We've covered how much meat you're actually going to get at when if you purchase a beef or a hog. We talked a little bit about where to get prices. We talked about meat quality. So when you're paying that dollar per pound for the animal, what type of quality are you going to get? Is it worth it? And then we talked a little bit about the difference in pricing. You're paying for the animal, and then you're paying for someone to actually provide the service for you. And then depending, as Dr. Sullivan was saying, depending upon the customization and the type of products you want, there can be additional charges there. And then once you purchase the animal and it's harvested, you get the animals, hopefully you've had a quality eating experience and you've basically purchased the product that you want, and that it's a good opportunity for you. As I said, there's a lot of reasons why people purchase local meat besides just a lot of people believe that the product is better, but a lot of times they say they want to support local local farms, and in many cases, depending upon how the product's priced, producers actually or consumers that we talk to actually say, yeah, well, I actually save money when I purchase it in bulk. And this concept would be similar to the idea of like a Costco or Sam's Club model, where if you purchase things in bulk, you generally tend to get a lower per unit cost than if you were to purchase them individually. So we hope you've learned something. We're gonna stay on here for another 15, 20 minutes or however long you want. What questions do you have? Things that you've heard, or just questions that you've had about either meat production, purchasing the product that we could answer for you.
So one thing with that, Elliot, is I think it's important to think about that we have a safe quality meat supply in the US, and regardless of where you get it from, you can get what you want. But this is just another way to provide choices for what people want. And there's a variety of products and a variety of options that are out there based on what the consumer wants. And I think that's what's great about it is you can choose whether you like it or not. You can choose to go where you purchase it from, but you're going to get a safe product.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Gary. So if you have questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we can get to them now. You're welcome, Luke. As we appreciate the comment. Said great presentation. Thank you. Luke will be providing this, sending this out to you as well. You'll have the recording that you can reference, and also the slides that you can click on the links as well. So Dave said the graphic with an upright freezer, would that be in the typical example of a whole beef? I'd have to go back to that, Dave. Gary. That has some pork in there, actually. That's on the middle one, that's pork. I think this is a combination of meat products, actually. Because you got some broilers up there as well.
Yeah, so it's going to depend upon the freezer that you have, but I think when we reference the amount of coolers that it takes, I think that may give you kind of a reference. You're gonna put more in a freezer than what you think it's going to take, and so having a mostly clean deep freeze is going to be important if you're getting a whole beef animal.
And Dave, we can get you like some exact measurements of like so many pounds of beef would fit in this type of cubic freezer as well. I think is kind of what you're getting at. You're thinking, hey, I've got this deep freeze at home, and maybe I'm thinking about purchasing the animal. Could I actually fit in it right now? So without buying something else. So thanks for that comment. Eric asked, what questions would you ask a producer of beef in order to determine the odds of giving prime graded meat? Good question. Gary, you want to take this first, and then
so one of the things I would say is, if this is a producer that also sells livestock to larger processors, you may see what their cutout yields are. And so most processing plants, large processing plants, are going to give feedback to the producer on what their cutting of the different percentages are and go with that. Nationwide, we're at about 12% prime. And so if you want to just go on averages, 1 out of 8 carcasses may be a prime carcass, but there's so many factors that go into it. I think going from when some of the original research talking about eating quality on different quality grades, the eating and positive eating experiences, the biggest jump really goes from select to choice. And then if you go to choice to prime, there is a greater likelihood of a positive eating experience, but you don't get as big of an increase. And so it's going to be hard to ensure you get a prime beef. But that being said, see what their track record is. Some will select genetics. Part of the reason why we're getting more prime now is we're feeding the animals longer to that heavier weight. And I think that also is a big contribution to the amount of prime beef that's out there.
Yeah, Eric, I would add to that. If you talk to the producer and ask him, what they're feeding them at the end. If they're on grass and they're fed their whole life on grass, the likelihood of you getting a prime beef product is lower than if they're fed corn. And that's one of the primary reasons why they feed corn and other types of protein and energy products to livestock, is because it does tend to deposit fat in the muscle. And so if they're so talking to them a little bit about what they're feeding their animals at the end can give you an idea. Gary mentioned if they have historical. And I just ask about a picture. A lot of times they'll send you pictures. They'll send me some pictures of meat that was, harvested the last time. Or so I would ask for that. And then the other thing I would ask is say, hey, do you have one of your customers I could talk to? Someone who's purchased, and they might be able to give you that information. And then just call them up and say, hey, what was your eating experience? Do you think it was great? If you really want prime graded meat, you could ask to say, hey, I want to pay for a certain meat product, and maybe they would have it federally inspected and send it to a meat processing plant. So those are some suggestions. There's obviously no guarantee when you purchase the animal unless it's federally inspected that it's going to be prime. Amara said, thanks for the info. Yep, you're welcome, Amara. So we appreciate you being here and hope you learned something. Michelle said, you said that you have a list there, Dennis, Gary, of places where we get meat from. Yes, we'll send that over. Our primary link, if you go back here, this is where we can get livestock producers from. If you're thinking about buying meat itself, like that would be most likely from the farmers market. The University of Nebraska does sell, beef and pork. If you're interested, we'd be more than happy to supply that to you as well. But we will send out these links and also the different magazines as well, where you can get that information as well, Michelle. So hopefully that will be helpful. Thanks, Ryan. Or Dave, you said thanks. You're more than welcome. Ryan Evans, who's helping moderate our webinar today, just kind of put those links in there for you, Michelle, right now, and whoever else is still around. So the Department of Agriculture has that list. We obviously have buy fresh, buy local, and just there's a lot of different ways. Especially if you start calling around and talking to producers, you can get an idea. It is important to do your research on this, though, right? So talk to some producers, ask them about where their plant is, or their animals are being processed. And, just like not every business is the same, not every producer is the same, and not every meat processing plant is the same. And so find something that's going to work for you and what you're trying to get out of this purchase. So Dave said on pork, what is a good thickness on chops? Gary, this is right in your wheelhouse.
So this is really up to your personal preference. One of the things with pork is the more you cook it, the drier it's going to get. One change that has occurred over the last probably 20 years is some of the recommendations on cooking. And so, everyone wanted to make sure you fully cooked pork to make sure you got trichina killed and things like that. Well, with trichina, you're actually able to kill it at lower temperatures. A lot of the pork recommendations is actually cooking the pork and holding it at 145 degrees for 4 minutes. And that's going to allow a juicier, higher, better eating experience with that. And so one of the things when you think of thickness of porks and pork chops, I like mine about an inch because I think it's easier to cook it, hold it, and not overcook it to have a positive eating experience. And so really up to you on preference. If you want to go thin to do like kind of a surface sear, more for like a breakfast style chop or like what you might see in some Latin American markets, you can do that. But if you're going to have just like a grilled pork chop, I think an inch thick pork chop is a good kind of standard to go with that. We got a couple other questions from Mike in the Q&A. When it comes to bison processing, bison are not included in the list of mandatory inspection. And so they actually fall under what is a voluntary inspection. And so if you look at it, all inspected meat product has a circular bug inspection legend on it as it's going through it. Bison is actually going to have a triangular one, and that's just because that different in the status of inspection. The other thing is that means that the processor is having to pay for that federal inspection where it's done as a service, otherwise as part of from FSIS. And so it will go under a very similar inspection process and inspection and safety requirements. Uh, However, one difference from beef is there's not grading in bison. And so you won't get a choice or prime or select quality grade bison. And so some similarities and differences when it comes to inspection, but no grading that comes in the bison.
And a lot more, say there's a lot less waste also as well. I mean, there's a lot of ground beef and it's a pretty lean product as well. So
Yeah, so you're going to end up with a lot of ground bison that goes through it. There's also fewer places that are able to handle bison just from the size of the animal, as well as some of their handling characteristics. Not most places aren't set up to handle bison, and so you do need to find out specific plants that do process bison if you're of interest, have interest in that.
yeah. And Mike, you also asked, are there specific resources available to help me find grass-fed or grass-finished beef producers? And I would start with this list that Ryan has put in the chart. And if you're unable to find something, we're obviously here to act as to help for you, and we can make that connection as well if you're not having that success. But great, these are all very great questions. So thanks for asking those. What other questions do you have that are things that are on your mind, things that you've heard that we could answer? Real quick for I know some people might be writing in the chat right now, but real quick, we want to do more of these. Gary and I would love to hear if you could after you've listened to this, if you could learn one more thing in a webinar at a future time, what would that be? If you could put that in the chat for us real quick, and then we'll work together to put something together. And I'm sure other people have similar questions as well. So put in the chat, what is one thing that you would want to see a webinar on related to, really anything about consumption of food products. It could be meat, it could be other products as well. What's that one thing you'd want to see a webinar or just more information on? Selling, so Clara says selling direct to consumer for producers. Michelle said how to cook different meats, how to smoke meats in a smoker. Yeah, so some on the cooking side of those products. Eric said, what would you say is the optimal hanging time, 90 or 100 days? I assume local producers don't wet age. We'll come back to that question here real quick. Breaking down, so how to break down a 10-pound tube of ground beef. Okay, so good. So so what I'm hearing is a little bit on how to sell. What do we do with those meat products once we have them? I think that's some great thoughts. Good. Yeah. I would like to know more. And then Mike said, I'd like to know more how to source more sustainably raised poultry. Okay, so kind of where to get those locations as well. Great. This is really great for us, and we'll work together to put a few more webinars on that. Eric, let's ask your question. Gary, I think you do a lot of stuff on dry age, so let's address that.
Yeah, so when we're talking about hanging time, most plants are going to really be talking about up to 14 days. Some will go up to 21 days on that hanging side. You might get a few that will go longer on it. The challenge is you're really going to start getting mold and you're going to get drying on that surface. And when you go to cut up that dry aged product, you end up with a lot of waste that goes along with it. And much of that isn't really salvageable for a lot of it. And so most small processors, you're correct, aren't going to be doing a wet aging process. But really their dry aging or their hanging time is going to be limited to 14, maybe 21 days. When we think of that tenderization that takes place post-mortem, a lot of it's going to happen within the first 7 days. You're going to get a little bit of improvement as you continue to go longer in that, but it's really fits the supply of diminishing returns as you go through it, or law of diminishing returns. You're going to get less improvement in tenderization the longer you go in an incremental manner. And so, we're going to be looking at that. And so we're talking 2, maybe 3 weeks time on that.
It's kind of where you're gonna get the most bang, most flavor, most beneficial product development in that 2 to 3 weeks. Everything after that is you're gonna get improvement. It's just gonna take a lot longer to get there, and it's gonna be a lot more costly.
Yeah.
And I would say a little bit. I mean, there's been a lot of probably what you're getting at. There's been a lot of YouTube channels out there about dry aging, and essentially trying to put dry aging to the extreme. Like, I dry aged this for 3 years or something like that, and this is what it tastes like. But for most consumers, I would agree with Gary. It's about that 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, one last question that we'd like to ask you. Obviously, we can do webinars, and we've chosen we all have kind of daytime jobs, and so we wanted to do it at nighttime. Just real quick, we wanted to ask you, if we were to do these again, is nighttime the best time to do it? So maybe just tell us a little bit of how you want to receive this. Is a webinar? Is it in just kind of short videos? And is it nighttime a good time to do these? Why don't you put that in the chat? Yeah. So Michelle said, yeah, evening is great, webinar style. Yes. Mike, I'm sorry. Yes, game 5 tonight. Sorry about that. Didn't mean, hopefully you had it on in the background. Dodgers, didn't complete the sweep yesterday, but we'll see. So good. Sorry about that. Recognize that. And we have Halloween tomorrow, so obviously tomorrow we didn't want to do that. So Erica said this time was good for me. Webinar is good. Okay. Thanks for that feedback. So Erica, you said, I've often wondered how much it actually costs the producer to completely raise the animal all the way to processing. Yeah, so this is a really good example. This is stuff that we've done here at the university. When we talk about how much it costs to raise that animal, it can actually be quite expensive when we think about they have to have basically a mama, what we call a cow, and then they have to pay for that animal. And so we tend not to think about it in terms of one animal. We tend to think about it in terms of the life of that mom. So that mom might have 5 to 7 animals that will each kind of raise through time. And then depending upon what they're fed and the land that's being used and how that, the cost really varies pretty considerably from producer to producer. I would say that most producers are going to put a specific dollars per pound markup in the beef. At least the ones that I've talked to, they're saying this is generally what it costs me to produce it. This is kind of my retail markup, and then they're going to try to sell animals at that rate. Gary, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't spend as much time looking at the production cost anymore, but there's definitely a whole lot more input costs than most people think of. And it's not inexpensive to be raising livestock. And there is, as Elliot said, there is usually a markup because there's extra work that goes into it. They're searching out the owner or the the customers. They are lining all that up. They're delivering small amounts at a time, and so there's definitely a time factor that goes along with that direct marketing of the product as well. Now, depending upon who you're getting it from, that markup may be a little bit or it may be a lot. It's also probably going to depend upon what your proximity is to major metropolitan markets. If you're in a much more rural area, my guess is there's less of a markup than if you're going to be closer to a metropolitan area. And so it's just going to depend upon what they're able to get for their product and how they can. But they're looking at how can they make a living for their families, and that's carrying through. And so um,
Yeah, so a good example of this, uh, Erica, is right now current markets in Nebraska. An animal. So remember, we have the three different weights: the live weight, the dressed carcass, hanging weight. That's all one of them, and then the final weight. A producer who's selling to a big meat processing plant is going to sell that animal at about $1.90 a pound. So $1.90 a pound is what they're selling that finished animal for. So that's the entire animal, bones, blood, head, everything. For the animal that's what we call dressed, hanging, or carcass weight, that plant processing plant is paying about $2.96 a pound for that animal. So that's what current prices are that producers are receiving if they don't sell directly to consumers. So hopefully and this changes, right, week to week, month to month, year to year, but that's what we're currently at. So if you're talking with producers and they're saying, hey, I'm going to charge you $3.50 a pound on the hanging weight, that that cost of doing business to you is about 50 cents right now, 50 cents a pound. That's what they're going to make uh, compared to just selling that animal to just a big processing plant that would then go through that food system that you would end up buying at Hy-Vee or Aldi or wherever you do your shopping. So hopefully that gives a little perspective on kind of where that cost is. So, yep, you're welcome. Any last kind of thoughts or questions that are on your mind? And once again, we'll send all this stuff out. Our contact information will be there as well. So if there's things that kind of come up, please let us know, and we'll answer the question or direct you to someone who knows. Erica, yes, we can send you. We have a good master gardener program that kind of works with community gardens, and our Buy Fresh, Buy Local also has those as well. And so we'll put you in contact with those people, and you can learn more about them and how to set them up. So that's great. That's another great idea for a webinar series as well. Okay. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you so much for coming on, spending part of your evening today. Especially appreciate Mike being here, given that the Yankees are playing the Dodgers tonight, so we'll let him get back to the game. But let us know if you have any questions. We'll provide that information, and we hope you have an awesome rest of your evening, and hope to talk to you soon.